Hello and welcome back. Today I would like to talk with you about these two journals that I recently created. But this video is going to be a little different from the ones I've done before because as I was making these books, I took the time to video certain stages of the creation of the book so that you could understand some of the steps in what is called forwarding. And forwarding are all of the steps of making a journal up until the time that you put the covering material on, whether that be leather or book cloth, paper, whatever you're going to use. And it will hopefully help you with some of the terminology and understanding some of those tutorials you've been watching. The first thing you do is you create the text block, and I'm using this red one because it videos better, but the two I actually made are in the top left corner. The first thing you do is you create some pages. I usually do some digital collage, and then I fold up signatures to where I have a text block that's about 1 to 1.25 inches because I find I can round and back that the easiest. I have gone up to as much as 1.5. This is then sewn on tapes. It's called supported sewing versus the all along Coptic stitch that I have demoed for you in the past. I will link the video below to where you can see that if you would like. But this gives you several possibilities of attaching the boards to the book. Whereas the all-along Coptic is only useful really for a case-bound book. One of the things you have to do after you created all of the text pages is that you do something called a made-in paper, and I'll link the videos on that below. But you basically are gluing the decorative paper to one of the folios, nesting another folio, and then sewing it in as part of the text block. One of the big problems with sewing is to keep the tension correct, especially on the kettle stitch, by pulling up on the kettle stitch and not jerking it to the side, which would result in a pinched end with a fat middle. And that is a book that just really cannot be rounded or backed in any reasonable way. And even trying to case bound it is difficult because it's not even across the book. The tension needs to be such that the threads can slide over the tape so that you can see here they slide enough that even just using my fingers I can begin to round the book without any tools whatsoever and get that gentle round that I like, which is not the 1/3 of a circle that they recommend. But that's just a personal preference and you can do with it as you will. These are the two text blocks I'm actually going to use. The first is a miniature. Miniatures are cute, interesting, but difficult to make because your tools just really do not fit to do this well when you're trying to do things like rounding and backing. Your hammer will not fit between the tapes. You can end up pinching things the wrong way. So usually what I do with these is I do a flat back case binding, but I'm really going to try this time to round and back this little devil and then glue things down and hopefully be able to sandwich that tapes and coverings in such a way that they will fit around the shoulder of the book and then go in to a prepared case binding. The larger text block has this additional little piece of paper called a waste sheet, and it's created as part of the end sheets. And it would allow me to do a split board binding where you would glue down the tapes to the waste sheet, fold the waste sheet up, trim it into a flange, and then be able to slide it into split boards. The problem with that is that that doesn't open very flat, so it's not good for a writing journal. So I will be doing laced on boards for this particular application. So here is the book that I am following along with for the instructions on my case-bound miniature book. It also has instructions for lots of other styles. Here's the little text block. You can immediately see that it's got some additional material added to it. I first trimmed up the foredge, rounded it, then trimmed up the back and the head and the tail of the book. You can see the little tiny shoulder that's on the book, which is the little raised area there that will accept the board. There's a mull lining, that's this thinner material here that's super strong. It's tapered so that the ends won't show, and then it's sandwiched with this craft paper so that it's well adhered to the spine. There's a little case that's got the front board, the back board, and the spine stiffener made out of card, and it's covered in book cloth and marbled paper that I had scraps of that were perfect for these kinds of little applications. I will glue these tapes down to the end paper, then glue the mold down to that, and it will be positioned on the back board such that the shoulder is tucked up to the board, and then the front cover will be pulled up and over so that board goes into the shoulder, and you will also have even squares. The larger book has come a long way at this particular point. There's multiple things that have happened. You probably recall it had this waste sheet, which I will tear off later. It just is here now to protect the book as we go through the various stages. The stages of this forwarding are many, and I usually use a prepared list of activities and check them off as I go along because I have missed things before. It's a long involved process, and especially when you're doing multiple books, you can have a big issue. So the first thing you do is you glue up the spine, you trim the foredge smooth, then you round the book over and you trim the head and the tail. And so that everything is nice and square and even, because you want the book to look perfect when you get done. You also are going to do a thing where you, over angled boards, create the shoulder, and that is to accept the board so that you have a smooth fold there, and no lumps and no binding of the board when it tries to open and close. When you have rounded the book, you apply fray knot or a muslin type fabric over the spine to help hold it in position, and it also helps with the sewing of the end bands. And you can see here that I've sewn the end bands, but I will then add more spine coverings that I'll go over later that will include a hollow tube and some cords. When you are sewing on the end bands, usually you have the boards already attached and the bands glued on, but I wanted to be able to show you some of the steps. So I'm a little bit out of order here, but I was very careful to keep these boards on the text block and clamped on while I was doing these other procedures so that I protected my shoulder. It's really easy to break down your shoulder and then your book doesn't function properly. You can see some marks here on the upper board. That's to indicate to me where the squares are. So when I'm lining things up, that little 3 millimeters at the head and tail, that's the size of the square that I use, helps me line up the boards. The foredge is not trimmed yet because you don't do that until you have glued in your tapes, because it could be a millimeter or so different from side to side, and then your book wouldn't be square if you had already cut things before you glued. So that's an important step. When you get the boards cut to the height of the book, then you have to create the places for the tapes to go. You can see here I've marked a line 10 millimeters in, and then marked where my tapes would go and chiseled them in. And then I'm showing you with this board that the chisel does not remove material. That material is still part and parcel of your board, so that once you've laced the tapes in, you will, and glued them, you will hammer those places down, and they will actually cinch in the tape and fill in any gap that you might have. In addition, I have done something here called back cornering, where I have taken off the little sharp edge of the book. You can see the difference from the one I've done and the one I haven't done yet. The backboard I have yet to back corner. And that just protects you from puncturing your leather when you're making your head caps. You can also see here where I've removed a little bit of material, making a little channel up to the place that I chiseled the hole, and that's so that when you glue down the tapes, it's all nice, flat, and flush, and you don't have lumps or bumps in your leather cover. And that is the important part of that. And one last little thing that you probably saw me playing with here is this little jig, and it's a little folded up pieces of paper. And it serves a really interesting function. It keeps the board from being pulled into the shoulder, or even worse, up over the shoulder when you have glued the leather. You want that little tiny bit of space, because leather pulls as it dries. And if it pulls it up and over the shoulder, your book will never open and close correctly. It'll be hanging open at an odd angle, and you basically have ruined the book. So somehow or the other, you have to create this little gap. There is another way to create the gap. Since you have a waste sheet, you could take a little bit of glue and run it along the shoulder and tip in a piece of binding cord that is about the thickness of this little turnip, which is, just a couple of millimeters at the most. And then when you go and tear out the waste sheet later on, it will be gone. But that little piece of card, and you got pieces of card, I'm sure, that you use for fill-ins and other things lying about, and that's a really easy jig to make. So that will be this stage of the book. In the next stage, you can see that things have been glued in. The boards are firmly attached. Before I attached the boards, I did do something called lining the boards, and the purpose of that was to create this little curve that you can see here. And that's because the lining warps the boards, but it warps them in the opposite direction from that which the leather's going to do when it pulls in the other direction, and ultimately your boards will end up flat. It also have been trimmed to the width. It's hard to see because I've capped up the book, and that's where you just put this protective deli paper on your book pages to protect them from the glue and the things that you're going to do. You can see here that I have added some linings to the spine. I first put on that cloth that you saw before, and then I added a paper lining to disguise the tie downs for the end bands, so there weren't any lumps there. And then I created this little tube that you can kind of see here, and that's because this is going to be what's called a hollow back binding. And when the book is open, that little tube spreads apart and the book can open more flat. In addition, I decided, I think I might want some faux bands, so I just kind of tacked on these little pieces of binding cord in places that I thought might make an interesting end band configuration. And as you saw at the beginning of the video, I did keep that and as part of the decoration. So now at this point, I'm ready to add my leather and do my sprinkling and any other decoration that I wish to do. So here's the completed book. As you can see, the end bands do show up quite well, especially after some tooling. The decoration here is coloring the leather and then doing some sprinkling processes. using a stencil. I had previously done what's called Cambridge panels. That was a series of rectangles. But in this case, I made the stencil and used it to do the various stages of the sprinkling. When I had colored it with the base color, I then put this little central piece down and sprinkled the book all over. And then I took the bigger part of the stencil, put it back on, and I'm not removing them, I'm just folding them over, but I removed those little angles and weighted that down, and then heavily sprinkled with a darker color of brown in those little triangles on the side. Once that was completed and totally dry, I then did some tooling with some bronze tooling tape around the edges and applied a little metal decoration from Butterbee scraps. The inside of this is some really nice superfine, Mohawk superfine paper, which is good for calligraphy or writing. And so this is just a little writing journal. The techniques on the outside were the important part of my learning experience. Here's the little miniature book glued up. You can see how the book boards came over and fit into the shoulder. The little decorative papers on the end. I used medieval Mirage's papers for the inside. And to do that, I wanted the front and the back decorated. So she had some papers that she called blank pages or background pages. And what I did was I printed those on one side of my 8.5 by 11. And then I picked out other pages that I wanted done, and hers are, in such that you would, it's a 2-page spread. And I printed it at what would be 5 by 7 so that I would get 2 pages, 2 folios, or basically that's 8 pages in a book, on one sheet of 8.5 by 11, and then cut those out and folded them up into signatures to create my little books. It's a good way to get the back covered and not have just blank white pages around, and still get the vivid coloring on the decorated pages that you wouldn't get if you tried printing on tea-dyed paper. It would be kind of muddied. And there's some really highly decorated pages and some less decorated pages where you could write on them. But honestly, I think this is more of a novelty and just something fun to do to practice certain techniques or to be able to show people different kinds of binding styles when I teach classes. So thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed seeing these 2 little books, and I hope that you learned a little something along the way.